Hey, tonight we have another edition of Ask a Philosopher because we have a real life philosopher here. Well, close enough for our purposes. Hey, tonight we have another. You know what? I got to close this video out. You know what? I keep forgetting to do that. I don't know why. But anyways, Nick Soutter is with us today. If you guys remember Nick, he wrote the Water Thief. The Human Codex, the Atheist Codex, which I'm still trying to figure out what the hell the difference is.
Nobody knows.
Doesn't matter. But he asked me the other day if we wanted to kind of go over a little bit about Ayn Rand's epistemology and moral ontology and other things that Ayn Rand had written about. Now, I'm not a huge Ayn Rand fan. I tried getting through Atlas Shrugged, and it was painstakingly, brutally boring, to say the least. I do a little bit about objectivism and egoism, but he's going to be actually speaking the most about this on his own because he's actually written... well, you actually kind of wrote... Did you write a book on this? Or
I did. The Water Thief is actually a rebuttal to Atlas Shrugged. So I read Atlas Shrugged. I was challenged to contest it, and rather than just talk about it, I said, why don't I write a novel that's a rebuttal? So it's a novel, but it's a rebuttal. And I'm gonna toot my own horn. Midwest Book Review said it should be read by every high school student in the country, and said it was the definitive rebuttal to Atlas Shrugged.
Is it high school, not college? Because that's where people start getting into this Ayn Rand objectivism.
Yeah, that's why it was deliberately. It was written a lot like 1984, so that it could be, you could read it at any age past high school.
Yeah, no, it seems like Ayn Rand was like kind of the gateway drug to philosophy, isn't it?
I think so. Absolutely, people read it and then they get really, and then usually people are broken from it, and sometimes they never are. But yeah, I think it's. Yep, I think they start there and go on.
Well, it's going to be interesting because, like I said, I really kind of wanted to dive more into some of her actual beliefs. It's hard to actually read that book and kind of gauge where the hell she's going with it. I'm still figuring out who the hell John Galt is. I don't even know what this
Oh, please don't tell me you just asked that question.
Yeah, what is it, like half the book is asking about that?
Yes. Well, that's why it's the big, and then you see people with their license plate, or not the license, but the bumper sticker, who is John Galt? And my favorite reply to that is, it's not you.
It's not you. It is me. It's all about me. It's all about me. It's about my satisfying I have to take care of my morals first, and duty to me, my moral being first. But anyways, so before we get into that, I wanted to discuss something real quick on what's going on Facebook with Bryce Davis. Now he's like another Duke. He's like another G-man. It's just, debate me, right? It's the same kind of mindset that I have no interest in whatsoever. I debated the Duke. We all saw how that went. He's still, to this day, literally months later, he's still going off on Twitter, saying how much he thinks he crushed me and much I don't understand these topics. And this guy Bryce Davis from Facebook, you guys might know him. He's doing the exact same thing, right? He's literally has said Steve is confused and is dishonest. And he said the same thing about Dr. Graham Oppie, right? I mean, here's one of the most prolific American, well, he's Australian, a contemporary, he's not American, he's Australian, but contemporary analytical philosophers in the entire world. His writings are brilliant. If you ever listen to him do discussions, I mean, he's just a masterful, articulate individual, and having a lot of these discussions about atheism and just philosophy in general. And, this guy claimed that he was, quote, confused and dishonest. And I'm like, look you can disagree with a philosopher. Trust me, there are PhDs in philosophy that I disagree with. That's a great thing about philosophy. Some philosophers disagree with other philosophers. Both they have PhDs. You got to pick. Well, you don't have to, but generally you pick one side, right? These philosophers agree with me. These ones don't. That's the nature of philosophy, right? So you could disagree with people with PhDs, because that's how it works in philosophy. It's not like mathematics as much where you say, hey, 1 + 1 = 2, and then you have a group of mathematicians going, no, 1 + 1 = 3. You don't have that in philosophy as much, right? So it's fine that you disagree with experts. There's nothing wrong with that. We all do that in philosophy. But what you don't do is say, hey, here's a person who's well-established, that knows the literature, that writes the literature, that literally is a person who writes the academia for this stuff, and tell people that he's confused and dishonest. That I have no consideration for it. At that point, you lose all credibility with me, which I've told him. He said, well, you never had credibility with me. And I'm like, well, why does it matter? Who are you? You are somebody that nobody will ever take seriously, because anybody who reads your writings can see you have huge epistemic faults, right? And I've explained these things to him, but of course, what the hell do I know? Even though other people have jumped in and said, yeah, Steve's not wrong here, but you're just not understanding it. So one of the things I really want to get out of the way before we get to the Ayn Rand thing is a common misconception that I see quite frequently. And Bryce did the same exact thing on one of his posts. I mean, he made the same fundamental mistake. And I'm going to actually screen share the post if I can move all this porn out of the way. 1 second.
You move that porn, I'm out of here. That's I
I'll
have
DM it to you later.
Share on my okay. I'm patient. I'm a patient.
I know how you like donkeys. It's okay.
Well, thank you.
Okay, so make sure I get the right screen. This is like a project doing this kind of stuff. Okay, so all right, so I'm screen sharing my screen now. This is a public page, so it's not like anything private. And he goes through this long litany about agnostic atheism, which I'm not going to get into. I've explained that numerous times. The fact that it's just agnostic atheism is not sensical to me in the weak case. It's superfluous in the strong case. It's fine if you say Gnostic atheist. That's okay, because that's modifying it with knowledge, and that's okay. I don't have a problem with Gnostic atheist. That's just somebody who says that I believe there's no gods, and I also claim there's no gods.
With the G.
With the G, right. Yeah, I mean, but Dr. Paul Davies, he calls it, he doesn't call it Gnostic theism, or excuse me, he doesn't call it Gnostic, he actually talks about Gnostic theism, but he calls it theistic Gnosticism, I think is the way he words it, but it's the same principle. But anyway, so he makes the same mistake that I see a lot of people that watch Atheist Experience make. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to go through the whole thing.
I'm going to interrupt because I see the live stream right here, and this doesn't look like this is actually going up to the live stream. Is it supposed to be?
It's going to the live stream. They're watching right now.
Well, I see the show, but people are still talking. But at least on my feed, I don't see any more. I don't see your screenshot up, but maybe I'm
can you guys see the screenshot on the outside feed?
I don't see your screenshot up, but maybe I'm
okay, 1 sec. Can you guys see the screenshot? Okay. I just looked at the live feed. I'm not sure. It's not showing.
That's what I'm saying, Steve. God gave you 2 ears.
Yeah, but only one of these sides works. So how am I going to do this then?
Okay.
What should? It should.
They don't need to see it. I just yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll read it to you. He says, finally, there's no such thing as lacking a belief either way. This is how many people erroneously interpret Gnosticism, but it's not about an actual thing. You either believe that something exists or you don't. There's no in-between position between holding a belief and not holding one. You either believe something or you don't. And beliefs are not a choice either. Nobody chooses what they believe. You're either convinced something or you're not. Now, this is called an equivocation fallacy. What equivocation fallacy is when you're using a word differently in the same type of argument. And he confuses what lack of belief is. The lack of belief either way for Gnosticism is not that you lack a belief whether you believe or you don't believe, right? So in logic, you have the proposition, let's say, God exists. The negation is God does not exist. It is true I either believe God exists or I do not believe God exists. That is a dichotomy. That is classical logic. Absolutely right on that. But this is where he makes his mistake. You're not lacking a belief between those two different things. You're not lacking a belief between believing and not believing. Agnostics don't believe. What you're lacking a belief is between not believing it's true and not believing it's false. So it's a completely different thing that you're lacking a belief from. You're not saying the proposition is true. You're not saying it's false. You're lacking a belief either way on that. But you're not accepting that the proposition is true. So you do not believe the proposition is true. So logically, it would be not BP or BP or not BP. I believe or I don't believe. Fair enough. That's where he's right on that. This is where he equivocates it. This is where his fallacy comes in. Lacking a belief either way is possible because you're not lacking a belief on do I believe or do not believe. You're lacking a belief of BP, or you're lacking a belief between not BP and not B, not P, meaning that I do not believe it's true and I do not believe it's false. You are literally between atheism and theism in the philosophical sense. So this is something that I see quite often with people that listen to the Atheist Experience a lot that gets us completely wrong. They keep on saying things like, well, you either believe or you don't believe. Nobody's denying that. That's like a fallacy of irrelevant thesis, it would be called. That's something that's true that nobody would disagree with in classical logic. You believe, or even Gnostic logic, you believe or you do not believe. But that's not what agnosticism is. Agnostics do not believe. It is a belief position that you are epistemically unjustified. You say a proposition is true or false. In this case, this is one use of agnosticism, right? Because agnosticism can be used different ways. It is polysemous. But with respect to the proposition of theism, right? With respect to the proposition of theism, the question is asking you, do you believe in God? The proposition is, does God exist? If you have no stance on that proposition, whether God exists or not, okay, you don't believe, obviously, but you don't believe it's true and you don't believe it's false. You don't believe either way. You lack a belief either way, literally. So when he says, finally, there's no such thing as lacking belief either way, that is fundamentally mistaken. Nick, do you agree on that?
Absolutely, and in fact, one of the examples, because we've been talking about this, and I think it was in a different thread where I come up with this. You examples. I'm trying to come up with a couple of go-to examples for this because I'm sort of new to actually caring about the argument. But I think, okay, take a child who was raised in a completely atheist. As an atheist, okay, so in a society where there is no concept of God. And I forget what's the one tribe that they found now where there's been no concept of God. They found precisely one. There is one tribe in human history that has no God concept. Now you walk up to that to somebody who's been raised in that society. When they're 21, you walk up and say, "Listen, there's a guy. His name is God. He exists. Here's a book. Do you believe me that he exists?" Well, he's got no way of making a belief claim on God because this is the first he's ever heard of it. True. So he's got no way of saying yes or no. So that's
false.
Hang on.
That's false. Okay, well,
hang on. We'll get to you in a second. One second.
I think you got he is incapable of saying he believes that there is a God or does not believe there is a God because he does not have the foundation to actually render an opinion. Does he hold a God belief? No, he does not. But it's not because.
Right.
But he is incapable.
He does not hold a belief.
He's incapable of
rendering. The definition of atheism.
I haven't even introduced you yet, and you're interrupting. We don't play that game here. Okay, let somebody finish their train of thought. Okay, so
it is a definition of atheism. You are correct. It is a definition of atheism. But please do not say the definition of atheism because there are actually multiple ones in every dictionary I've ever looked up. At any rate,
sorry, I didn't realize that you could hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
He is incapable of rendering an opinion and saying that he believes either for or against. Anyways, I think.
Yeah, and the same thing for a person. In order to suspend judgment, if you read Suspending Judgment by Dr. Jane Freeman, New York University, 2011, she maintains that one of the things for suspending judgment is that you have to have the wherewithal to do it. You have to actually understand and read the proposition. She is cited as saying that we don't come into the world as agnostic because an agnostic has to be somebody that actually tries to evaluate but realizes they're not justified to say that the proposition is true or false. Anyways, we have a couple people in here. We'll get to John's second. He came in afterwards. 661, who are you and what do you disagree with on this?
Hi, my name is Bryce.
Okay, it's Bryce.
And
okay.
I think I'm the guy that you guys are talking about.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I actually agree with the last statement. I think I'm not sure the gentleman's name was Nick.
Nick, call me Nick, please.
Yeah, that's I actually agree with your last statement regarding the definition of atheism. It's one definition of atheism.
Wait, did you just say you agreed with something I said? Can you put that in writing and hand that to my wife, please? Because this will be the first thing. So you were saying...
the definition, one of the definitions of atheism is lacking a belief.
Yes.
And what is
you
the
agree
definition?
to that, right?
What is a definition, Bryce? What is a definition?
The colloquial definition is
what is
a definition? If you open up a dictionary, what is that for? What does it tell you?
A dictionary gives you the common usage of words.
The usages of words, not prescribing how to use a word, but the usages in society, in modernity.
Correct.
Okay, so it's not defining the word. It doesn't tell you how a word is normatively used. It doesn't say you ought to use this. It's not normative and it's not prescriptive. You agree?
It's not saying that you ought to use it. It's saying that this is how the word is commonly used.
Right, but it's not prescriptive and it's not normative, correct?
Sure.
Okay, so when you're arguing certain things and you're arguing from a dictionary, all you're doing is saying, this is the word is how it's used. Nobody's disagreeing with that. This is why Argumentum ad dictionarium is a fallacy. It's because nobody's disagreeing.
Right, but that's not what I'm doing.
Well, you do it.
I'm not arguing from a dictionary.
Okay, so what is your argument? Is if everything I've said is true according to philosophical literature, right? What is your main disagreement is with?
Well, I didn't hear the beginning of what you said. I tuned in a little bit late. But my main disagreement with you and the way that you're presenting this, as though I am arguing from the dictionary usage, is that my argument is, in fact, that the way that people are using the terms atheism and agnostic and theism and Gnostic are the common usages. And when what you're doing is saying they ought to be used this way, and therefore how other people are using them is wrong.
You're
or you're
incorrect.
implying that
You're
they're
incorrect.
wrong.
That's not what I've ever argued, ever. And you're incorrect on both parts.
Well, I know that you haven't argued it, but you've proceeded through the discussions as though that's what your position is.
Okay, so argumentative ad
willing.
motive. Okay, so you're arguing to my motive rather than what I'm actually saying. Is that the case? Because the first thing you said is common. No, it's not common in anywhere in the academia. It's common within the little circles you run with, but in the real world, when you talk to actual people, I don't see that, and it's nowhere in the philosophy where you actually read the literature. It's almost non-existent for the most part, right? Mine
okay,
about it.
I'm not talking about literature circles or philosophical circles.
Okay, so when you say common, then what you mean is common specifically within your sphere is
atheist
what you mean.
Experience and American Atheist is basically is referring to.
Well, I just want to make.
Referring to what? I'm sorry.
Say it.
your sphere of atheists that you talk to.
You just said you're not talking about what he's talking about. You're not talking about academic circles. You're not talking about philosophical circles. You're not talking about all these other circles. You're talking the circles that you interact with.
Well, let me put it this way. When I identify as an atheist, and when I identify as an agnostic atheist, I'm capable of explaining what I mean when I say that. And when other people have identified with that, they're capable of explaining what they mean. And that's what's important. Definitions are not important, whether they're philosophical.
Okay, so first of all, that wasn't what we were talking about. We weren't talking about agnostic atheism. We can get there. But I have shown that it can mean up to 12 different things. It's ambiguous. It's ambiguous.
Well, it can probably mean more than that, but what it means is irrelevant
it can be
in general.
Okay.
The only meaning
okay,
that's
so I'm
relevant
just going to
is
throw out
what
a
the
term
person
that
who's
nobody
using
understands
it
until I tell them what I think it means, and yet it's just drivel. But no, but what I was saying.
No, that's why we have the dictionary, which gives us the common usage of the terms.
Multiple
we
common.
assume that
common
until
usages.
someone
says,
says.
You keep saying the. There are multiple usages. You said the common usage.
But
the broadest usage.
But I want to talk
the
about what you
broadest
actually
usage,
wrote.
which is usually the first definition.
You wrote, finally, there's no such thing as lacking a belief either way. And I explained very clearly how that statement is grossly incorrect, logically incorrect.
Is that a question?
Yeah, this is what we were talking about when you called.
Okay.
So you said finally.
I still don't know what the question is.
Yeah, you said finally there's no such thing as lacking a belief either way. This is how many people erroneously interpret Gnosticism. It's not actually a thing. Well, it is actually a thing. Your logic is incorrect on this. Gnosticism is not the position between I believe and I don't believe. Okay, there's no middle ground there. That is a dichotomy. Agnostics don't believe. What it is the middle ground is the lacking a belief either way of I lack a belief that is true and I lack a belief if it's false. I lack a belief either way. So the position of agnosticism isn't between I believe and I don't believe. It's between theism and atheism in the philosophical sense.
Here's the thing, Steve. You just said that agnostics don't have a belief either way.
Right.
Right, except that some of them do. Gnostic theists have a belief, or agnostic theists have a belief.
We're talking in the philosophical sense, not in your little world of make-believe terms that you want to use.
No,
okay?
Steve, the philosophical sense is your world. I'm
Okay.
talking in a general sense.
And I'm excluding your general sense for right now. In the philosophical sense, am I correct?
Well, if you're going to exclude the general sense, then what's the point?
For right now,
Okay.
this is a show on philosophy, not your little world. This is a show on philosophy.
Right, but you're using my arguments that I'm having in the real world to present as a philosophical position.
I'm going to ask you again, Bryce, because I really hate equivocation. In philosophy, can you lack a belief either way? Is agnosticism a lack of belief either way in philosophy?
No.
Can you logically show how that's the case?
I've seen no examples of none. I can't imagine supporting that position.
Yeah, it's
in philosophy, I don't. In philosophy, I don't know what the position. Sorry, I'm talking over
Okay,
somebody.
so in philosophy, you're not qualified to answer.
Or correct.
And I've never made the claim that I was.
Nobody said you did. Nobody said you.
Well, he didn't. But he's making. Yeah. But in his post, he's talking from a position of knowledge. He's pointing or information. He's saying to people that finally he's making a declarative statement, right? He's saying finally there's no such thing as lacking belief either way. That is a false statement because you can lack a belief either way in philosophy. Now, if you want to limit your scope and you want to say, finally, there's no such thing as lacking a belief either way in regards to believing and not believing, which still would make no sense to me, but at least it limits your scope, because you cannot lack a belief between believing and lack of belief. What does that mean?
That's obviously, the scope was narrowed to that, because that was in the context of the original post,
what does it
which
mean?
had to do with theism.
How do you lack a belief between belief and lacking a belief? What does that even mean? There's no middle ground between those lacking a belief and believing. You either believe or you don't believe. What would it mean to be in between that in classical logic?
I don't know exactly what I don't know if you're characterizing what I wrote correctly or what the full context is of that. But what I'm saying is whatever I wrote there was in the context of the discussion that I was having on theism, agnosticism, not from the philosophical position, but from how the terms are colloquially used.
Okay, let's use your colloquial. I'm jumping in. I'm doing an internal to yours right now. What
agnostic?
How can agnostic?
The definition of,
let him finish. Please let him finish. This is going to take a lot longer if you don't.
How can agnosticism be between? How can anybody argue? Or why would they argue? Because now it's a straw man. Because nobody ever argues this. How could agnosticism ever be between I believe and I don't believe? Who would argue that?
It's not.
Then who
are
okay? Oh no. I know you're not. But you're saying that it's not. And I'm asking you, who argues that it is? You're arguing something that nobody would ever argue.
But people have argued.
I've been in the 6 years and I've never heard one person argue that.
Okay, well, I mean, you would agree that
except for
there's
people like you,
people in that forum who you probably haven't talked to, right? You haven't talked to every single person there.
Okay, that might be true, but
I mean, I can name names, but he didn't give me permission to use his name. But the person who I'm referring to is in that chain.
How about this? No reputable person that I can imagine would argue such a silly thing.
Well,
maybe they wouldn't, but I wasn't having a conversation with one of the reputable people that you're referring to. I was having a conversation with this individual who made that argument.
Okay, but
therefore, I had to.
But you're saying lacking a belief either way. Again, you really don't clarify what you mean by lacking a belief either way. You can't lack a belief either way if you agree that if agnosticism is the position that you don't believe is true and don't believe is false, right?
I'm sure you're familiar with the Dumbball analogy that Tracy Harris and Matt Dillon.
Yeah, much more than you probably. I've actually broke it down logically.
Okay. Well, I mean, the way that I'm validating my statement as far as lacking a belief either way would be using that analogy. Now, if you were able to break that down more and demonstrate that position to be false, that's fine. But I haven't heard that argument.
So
I don't believe there's an even number of gumballs.
Right.
I also don't believe there's an odd number of gumballs.
Okay.
So I'm lacking a belief either way.
Right. So you lack a belief either way that they're odd or even, right? But you still either you believe that they're odd or you do not believe they're odd. That's a different dichotomy.
Correct.
That's a dichotomy. Either I believe they're odd or I do not believe they're odd. I do not believe they're even, and I do not believe they're odd is not a dichotomy. Those are called contradictories. That is Gnosticism.
So that's lacking a positive belief either way?
Yes.
Or that's lacking a belief in either one of the claims?
Yeah. That God exists or God does not exist. That is agnosticism.
I agree with that.
Then why do you Then why do you say something further along? You say, hang on. You say,
well, hold on. You just said something else. That you just said that is agnosticism.
Yes.
No, that is how agnosticism is used in philosophical circles.
This is a philosophical program. We're talking in philosophical context here. Yes.
I concede that point, but that's not how I was using it when I was having this discussion. You're mischaracterizing that argument as having
Bryce,
to do with
can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Okay, so outside of philosophy, what is your definition of agnosticism?
Agnosticism, as far as I know, is someone who is not asserting knowledge either way. In other words, it's...
So you agree? So you?
Yeah, I don't believe or know either way. I mean, if I don't believe, I can't know.
It has nothing to do with belief in the general sense because knowledge is only a subset of belief.
If you don't look,
you can believe things that you don't know.
So let me ask you this: if you do not believe that the
I'm really confused.
Yeah, well, this is what happens when you use colloquial terminology. People get confused. This is why it's imprecise. It leads to confusion. If you do not believe that they're odd and you do not believe they're even, you have a belief that you do not believe either way. Correct?
Yes.
Okay. So agnosticism is a second order belief. It is a second order belief that you do not believe either way. It is a belief position. It is stated as a belief position. Stanford says very specifically, Gnosticism is a position. You do not believe P is true. You do not believe P is false. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but that's basically what Stanford says. You've read that before. Where does that mention knowledge about that? It has nothing to do with knowledge about that.
Well, but the colloquial usage of agnostic refers to what can be known about the existence of God, and that's why I say it relates to knowledge.
But we're talking. But here's the thing, though. He asked you what your usage is, and you gave it. But do you understand that in all the writings you ever read, that the epistemological proposition of agnosticism is only a very, very small portion of all the writings? It's really not normative. What normative is for agnosticism is the belief that you do not have a position either way. That's how it's actually talked about almost ubiquitously. So when I say that I'm agnostic, I'm not saying jack shit about knowledge. What I'm saying is I don't believe God exists, and I don't believe that God does not exist. I have no
but this sounds like an argument. This sounds like an argument that we ought to be using the philosophical usage of the word agnostic.
I could argue
usage.
that only because it's more precise, but that's not where I'm going right now.
But you are arguing that. You're arguing. That's your argument.
Well,
right?
no, I'm arguing what it is. I'm arguing material facts right now. I'm not arguing. There's a difference between material facts and normative.
No, I'm not disagreeing with the facts. I'm agreeing with you that it probably. I'm going to agree with you because I'm not in a position to disagree that that's how the word is used in philosophy. My position is that that's not how I was using it.
Okay.
So for you to frame it as though I was in a philosophical discussion when I was having that conversation, to me, that's dishonest.
No, it's not dishonest.
Not what's going on there.
There's two things here. One, you admit you don't understand philosophy very well. You're sitting here telling people, I don't know how to use in philosophy. You feel like you can pontificate about it on your Facebook, telling people prescriptively this is the case. You don't say this is my opinion. You say this is. In fact, you literally said in the next sentence, if you are not convinced that a God exists, you are an atheist. Period. Now
that I agree with. I believe.
Hang on. Okay. Well, this is why you're logically wrong on it. Nick, did he not, when he first got here, admit there was multiple definitions?
He did after insisting that there was in fact one definition.
Okay.
He said first, but
I didn't. No, I never insisted that.
You said the definition. You said the definition. No, you said the definition of atheism, which implies one definition. I correct you.
And then I corrected myself when I realized I was on the air and said one possible definition.
Okay, so there are more.
I agreed with you that it was a possible definition. So there are several definitions.
Several definitions. Under my definitions, am I an atheist?
I don't know because I haven't had the conversation with you. I've been trying to have that conversation with you about what your actual beliefs are, but you tend to want to have the discussion of what words mean or how to properly use words.
No, that's you. That's you. You're arguing what words mean. I'm arguing concepts and logic. You are arguing semantics. You are literally arguing meanings and semantics.
I'm arguing how words are used because when we use these words, they're labels that represent us.
In academia and how that's actually used in the literature, just like a biologist would. You're arguing to me.
Is a Facebook page academia?
You're arguing to me like a creationist would. Hey, Steve, evolution just means change. Oh, evolution theory just means guess, because dictionary. This is how I hear from you.
Steve,
let me finish.
Is the Facebook page academia?
It's irrelevant.
Is that
these are concepts that you're prescriptively. You are telling people misinformation. You're telling people things that are absolutely wrong, and I'm calling you out for it.
It's not misinformation if there's multiple definitions.
If there's multiple definitions, agnosticism in philosophy is not considered to be atheist or theist. It is not either one. Do you accept that arguendo right now?
Yes.
Okay. So you said if you're not convinced God exists, then you're an atheist. Period. No, I just gave an exemption to that. I gave it to Feeder. I do not believe in God. But I'm not an atheist. There is the feeder to your statement right there.
That's fine, Steve. And you can do that because in the philosophical sense, you're using we ought to be using this.
Not how we ought to. This is not ought. This is not normative. Right. You keep getting confused there.
Right.
Nick, help him out.
Steve,
he's confused.
Bryce, give me a sec. First of all, you said I was strawmanning you because you didn't, because I had said that you said that there was the definition, and that you then later.
You said that I said that was the only definition.
Please let me finish. He had asked if you had ceded his point or not. You did cede the point that there were multiple definitions after stating that there was the definition. Now, the reason that's not a straw man, I wasn't trying to say that you even meant what you said. What I was trying to say was that you were being imprecise and that you were using, in order to try to speak about what was your point, you said the definition when in fact you're fully aware that there are multiple definitions. And repeatedly in this conversation, when you're talking to Steve, you keep saying the definition or the this or that's the way to use it. Now, I know that's not what you mean. What you mean is the way you're using it or your circles use it. But what he then argues is what you're saying, because that simply isn't what you're saying. And you've been saying a lot of things here that when you're talking to Steve corrects you and then you say you agree with him, but then you end up saying something different. And I fully believe you don't mean it that way, but he's going to argue based on what you say. And so when you say on Facebook or anything else, look, this is the definition of atheism, this is the, you're going to have a problem. And what just happened with Steve, in fact, was you had once again said, this is how it works. And what he's saying is, no, it's not. It's one way it works. It's one way it works. And you're willing to acknowledge that. And you find that a very important acknowledgement when you're saying, hey, on Facebook, we're using a different way. You're right. But what you're not willing to acknowledge, what you keep actually strawmanning Steve with, is saying that he is trying to prescribe his way as the only way. And I've never seen him do it. I don't think that's what he's doing. And if you can pause a second and maintain the same standard for yourself as for him, which is to say that there are multiple ways, you can discuss with him the context and what way you meant and whether that was maybe more or less appropriate. But you can't even get to that point in the argument because you're so busy at first granting what he says, because I do believe you agree with it, and then inadvertently through an imprecision in language saying that he's wrong. And I don't think you mean to, but once you say it, he's going to correct you. And then you sit there and say, why are you correcting me? I agree with you. Well, because that's not what you said. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And the only thing that I would have to say in response to that is the reason I said that you were strawmanning me is because what you actually said that I said was that this was the only definition. And that's clearly not what I said.
When you say the definition, it implies the only definition.
I said you implied it.
I understand that.
That's not what I said.
I understand that.
Because he just that's not what I said. What I said was you implied it. If you play back the tape, I didn't say you said that. I said you implied it, which is what you did. You used the word the. Those are two different things. I did not say you said it. I said you implied it.
Okay, and again, let me make this clear, because I don't think it's understood that when I made that statement, I did not believe I was on the air. I was actually
okay. But just
I was making that statement to a person who was in the room.
You just said I said it. I didn't say it. I said you implied it.
And just real quick, let me say this too, is because of what Nick just said too. Many times in the last several minutes, you have accused Steve of saying that this is the way you ought to use the word, and in reality, you have come off like that as if you are trying to say you guys ought to be using it the way I use it.
Which is not necessarily.
So I'm not saying
that's not what you're trying to say. I agree. That's not what you're trying to say.
That's what it sounds like. That's the way
you come off of.
That's what it sounds like.
And let me
clarify two things first. One, when I use an ought argument, which is normative, right? There's two ways to use the word normative. One is in general how things normally are, or most often in these types of discussions, normative means what you ought to do. Now, normative here, if you ought to use the words the way I'm using them if you want to understand the literature. That is true. I do argue that, because there's no way you can read a paper which you've never read and use the terminology you use. The paper makes no sense. It just won't. Right? So you ought to use the way that I'm prescribing them to people to use in that sense of it. Okay? But I would recommend this to you. You need to go open a book on fallacies. I've noticed you and other people normally throw out these fallacies as you think they're making a counter argument, and you're not using the fallacies correctly. Have you ever read a book on fallacies? Because I highly recommend
Can you give an example of that?
Straw man fallacy, argumentum ad populum you accused me of today, which was not an argumentum ad populum.
I still think it was, but
no, it's not. If I say, can you give me an example of how I use argumentum ad populum, please? And I know these fallacies. I've done videos on them. I took them in college. I actually took this course.
Steve, most people agree you don't know any of these fallacies.
I know, right? Well, how did I? We'll give them a shot. How did I commit the argument ad populum?
I actually wanted to clarify the argument that I was making as far as whether or not I was making an ought argument. I actually concede that I was. My position was, I was saying that we ought to use the colloquial definition of terms, or we ought to assume them when people use them in settings like Facebook, because the people there are generally not philosophers. And so unless someone says I'm approaching this from the philosophical standpoint, of the philosophical definition, then that's fine. But that's clearly not the way that people are approaching it.
Let me give you a counter. Every time we use the word evolution, we should clarify evolution means a change of allelic frequency. And when creationists come in and say evolution just means change, we have to grant it to them, because unless they tell us otherwise, we should assume colloquial definitions of words like evolution and theory, because they're dealing with biology on Facebook. We're not talking about biology. You hear how really ridiculous your argument is when it comes to that?
I'm sorry, I didn't see the. I know you're trying to make an analogy here, but
you're not seeing the analogy there.
Yeah.
Well, no, I'm not sure I understand your analogy.
That's
you did speak a little quickly. Try again, maybe.
Right. When you argue that we should be using colloquial words for these types of discussions, because this is not a philosophical class, that's the same thing as I hear as creationists saying we should use evolution to mean just a change, or theory just to mean guess, because that's the colloquial meanings of these words. We're not in a biology course. We're not discussing biology. We're just on Steve's page. It's not a biology course. So why would we use formal definitions unless we say when we use evolution, we need to be saying that we mean by a change of allelic frequency? No. The normative, hang on, let me finish. Words like evolution normatively are the change of allelic frequency. Right? Words like atheist, normatively in philosophy and pretty much in all my discussions that I have with people, are the way they're used in philosophical literature. Now, in your little groups, in your specific little groups, you have a point there. If you guys want to use the words colloquially when you're talking to a bunch of atheists in your own little groups, go nuts. As soon as you leave the scope of your little group, you're in the rest of the sphere, and we don't have to cater to you. We don't have to say you have some dominion over words. We use the words.
Yeah, but here's the thing,
let me finish.
That was my group, and you were in it.
I highly advise letting him finish.
This is on your particular page, by the way, and you do the same thing on my page. You've come to my page and said these same things. So don't say that it's your particular group, okay? You've said the same things across the board.
No, this discussion was on my page, and you were in it.
Yeah, and you also have said the same things to me in Atheists versus Christians, and a couple other groups, and including my Facebook page. Right, so don't tell me that this is isolated to your little group. You go outside your little group, and this is why I call bullshit. You cannot tell me how to use a word. I don't tell you how to use a word. I don't tell you how to use things. But there is something called logic, and the logic is what you said here is logically incorrect. Not that it has to do with semantics. You said that a person who does not believe in God is always an atheist. Period. Once you add on that period, your logic is done. You're game over. Because once you acknowledge there are different definitions, no, that is not period. There are obviously instances of people that do not believe in God that are not atheists. You've already capitulated that by recognizing that there are multiple definitions. Do you understand that?
Okay, then how about this? How about if I concede to the fact that I should modify that particular stance by adding a qualifier? Anyone who says they don't believe in God or anyone who says that they do believe in God is not an atheist per the primary colloquial definition, the number one usage of the term.
Well, by any definition, I would say on that. If you believe in God, you're not an atheist by any definition.
Just went to the other side.
Okay.
I think you may have said that incorrectly.
See, I'm an active listener. I do this. I do this literally for a living. I have to listen.
Yeah, you are a good listener. I caught that a second. I'm not an active listener.
Also, Bryce, I have some bad news for you too. Any discussion about belief or non-belief in God is a philosophical discussion. I don't care whether you realize it or not.
Well, it may be a philosophical discussion, but that doesn't imply that the people you're speaking to are philosophers who are using philosophical.
But we talk about evolution. We're not all biologists, are we?
Right, and that's why I don't make assumptions about what other people are based on the words that they use. I ask what they mean by the words that they're using, because words don't have meaning.
Why don't you add this as a qualifier? Why don't you say at the very beginning, I do not know much about philosophy. None of this applies to philosophical literature. Don't take me as somebody who knows what I'm talking about. And then I'll be cool
because
with that.
That's not necessary on a Facebook
I think it really
page,
is.
especially when it's mine.
Well, again, these are
that's
arguments.
My Facebook page. If I do it on yours, then
you have done it. You've done it. You've done it on other places too. Come on, Bryce, be honest.
I've done it in the Atheists versus Christians Facebook page. I don't recall ever being to your page, so I don't think that's accurate.
You were on my page today.
I've done it on my page, and I have done it there.
Wait a minute. So you call me dishonest. You call me confused on my own Facebook page. Don't tell me you don't remember going to my Facebook page.
Right. No, I do believe that you're dishonest, and I think that
you
were
just said you
confused
haven't been
about
on my Facebook page. I pay attention to what people
I don't know
say.
that
This
I
is
did
why
it
I'm
on
very
your-
good
I
at
don't
this
recall
stuff.
doing it on your
Just-
Facebook page.
just
Steve.
FYI,
I do recall saying that.
a couple in the chats have said that they've wanted to.
Yeah, we're
this
going to
isn't-
move on. We're going to move on to Ayn Rand. Thank you, guys. But yeah,
Sure.
I just want people to note that he's the one saying that I'm confused on this and I'm dishonest. Anybody who's listens to this who thinks that I'm confused and dishonest, just unsub for me now. Just, you're not worth my time. I mean, I'm not even going to... Seriously.
Yeah,
That's just bizarre.
Yeah, I'm just going to say, this is the last thing I'll say.
Sure.
I don't recall actually being on your page. I remember these discussions with you. I don't think any of them were actually on your page, though. They were on my page, and they were on Atheists versus Christians. And I think on the Atheists versus Christians Facebook page, you're right. I should add a qualifier if I'm going to make statements like that.
Well, why is it you think that I'm confused when I'm actually somebody who's actually read up on these topics and I talk to actual philosophers? Like, I talk to Graham
I'm not
Hoppe.
suggesting that you're
If we don't
confused
end
on
it,
these
it's gonna
topics.
go on forever.
Yeah, I know. But I will
I'm not saying that you're confused on these topics. This is, again, where I think you're misrepresenting my position. What I'm saying is that you were confused about what I was actually saying.
No, I know what you're saying. I know you're.
And I think you may still be. I think you may still
Well,
be.
I really am not. Trust me. I've been doing this a long time, and I
Okay.
understand the colloquial arguments. And it was on my page that where you specifically said that I was confused and dishonest.
Okay, I'll take your word from that. I don't recall that, but it was in reference to what the position that I actually held. I think you were misrepresenting me, and I think you were trying to make what I was saying in the philosophical context and not in the sense that I was using it. To me, when you're on a Facebook page and you have a title that's, theists, agnostics, meaning common usages, then it's implied that you're using common usages.
Yeah, when you get a chance, go to yesterday at 5:30 p.m. on my particular page. I said, asking for scholarly citations is now dishonest. Who knew? And who knew the renowned atheist philosopher Dr. Graham Hoppe was confused and dishonest, which you did call him that. And I wonder, and you wonder why I don't waste time with these people. They're GM-level atheists. That's on my page right now, yesterday at 5:30 p.m. And you were commenting on my page.
That's fine.
So,
yeah, I can see that. That's fine. I don't recall being on your page, but
I'm the one
I was
confused.
actually making the comment.
I pay a lot more attention than you think. Okay.
Yeah, that actually, I'm looking at it right now. It's on my page actually.
There's definitely some confusion going on here, but I don't think you're identifying the right party.
Who?
Yeah, no, that's actually my post.
I'm talking to Bryce.
No, I'm looking at my page
Pardon
right
me?
now. It's literally on my page at yesterday 5:30 p.m.
Please choke Steve out for a second so we can move
All right.
on.
So thank you guys. We're going to be moving on to Ayn Rand.
That was literally in the chat. I wasn't making that up.
That's why I came.
All right. Thanks, Bryce. All right. So moving on to Ayn Rand. So again, the Ayn Rand, the Gatorade drug. I have so little to add to this. I mean, literally what I know about Ayn Rand's philosophy and egoism, I can fit in a thimble. Thimble. Thumble. I'll just say this. Look at as far as I know about egoism, and Nick, you can kind of start us off. But egoism, the way I understand it, which is going to be probably flawed, is that her argument seems to me that she's arguing that if you don't have some kind of self-interest, some moral self-interest to yourself, that you don't put yourself first and base your moral ethics on yourself, then you can't even begin to have any kind of help to anybody else or do anything to anybody else. That there's this descriptive thing, whether she described descriptively and also as normatively, which would be more of a, which she calls it, I think, rational egoism.
Rational egoism, yes.
Which would be a normative rather than descriptive. But it seems like her argument is basically this: hey, you know what? Self-interest, self-interest, self-interest. Without my self-interest, then nothing else. I can't even get to anywhere else, either whether it be economically, morality, or anything else. Is that kind of, in a summary, her position?
Very, very close. The only thing I'm going to add is you're under no obligations to do anything for anyone else under any set of circumstances for any reason. So you are assuming that perhaps you might want to do things for other people, and she thinks that that's immoral. So if you cut that part out, then yes, you're correct.
That sounds good. All right. Hey, I'm just going to mute here and sit back and listen to you kind of talk about Ayn Rand for a while. Maybe we all can glean something.
All right. Well, good. And I realized I may end up getting up and walking around because I like to walk, and then this is going to be an empty chair. So we're going to have the empty chair fallacy. That's not actually a fallacy. What is that called? The empty chair, when somebody, you're arguing against an empty chair. At any rate, all right.
I mean, like Clint Eastwood?
No, when somebody does a radio show interview, and then someone gets up and says, "Oh, that's it, I've had it," and they get up and they leave, and then the interviewer keeps the interview going without the other person there to rebut the facts. That's called an empty chair interview. It's at any rate, we'll accuse Steve of it, whether I'm here or not. Steve, I just wanted to. The other one thing I want to say is and there are witnesses here. I was really hurt when you said that there was no amount of alcohol that could make me attractive. He said that like two or three nights ago on it.
Well, hang on. Let me clarify. To me, okay, because I am straight.
I know to you. That's what makes it worse.
Yeah. Never gonna happen.
I pushed up my monthly shower.
He pushed up.
Okay, just turn it off. I know you don't want to listen.
I could not get that desperate. Sorry.
Hey, Nicholas.
You're a good-looking guy. That's not my type. What do you want?
In Steve's defense, Sweet Heathen was in the room at the same time.
Yeah.
Okay.
She's very distracting to me. What do you want?
All right.
I'll be visiting with her in August, by the way.
Nice. All right, so we'll start with the sort of the basic, and I'm going to get a little bit into the economic collapse. I'm going to cover a whole bunch of things because I find this particularly interesting. But we'll start with where does objectivism, which is Ayn Rand's philosophy, where does it start? And first of all, there are a couple of things most people don't understand about her. She actually was a philosopher. She's listed as a philosopher. That was sort of her where she, I shouldn't say where she started, but certainly where she ended up. She was well respected, even if people did not agree with her. She got interviews on national television and was well respected for her beliefs. And actually, I am a big fan of many of her beliefs. I take a few objections to things that I think undermine the entire system, but I am a fan of her in many ways. She starts with the law of identity, which you'll find in many of her works. A equals A. And the idea that nothing unreal, or sorry, I was about to quote Star Trek, nothing unreal exists. Sorry, all things that exist, and all real things exist. So if we keep Spock out of the rest of this. Once you identify the fact that you are real, and we're going to take that as an objective fact, which is what she said, and that's where sort of everything starts from in her mind. Your only obligation is to yourself. That's it. Now, objectivism is a neoliberal philosophy. Now, you guys have probably heard of neoliberalism before. What's his name? Who's from the Austrian school? One of the congressmen, he always runs on the Republican platform, always gets creamed. Big Ayn Rand fan, but he's actually an Austrian economicist, and Austrian is part of the neoliberal school. So there are a lot of different philosophies under neoliberalism. But people always get confused, and I say, well, and I've actually had arguments where people say, well, neoliberals are Democrats and they're liberals. No, they're Republicans. Neoliberal refers to liberalism in the same way that libertarian does. It's from, I want to say the 1600s, Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations. That was liberal ideology at the time. So neoliberal refers to the libertarianism, the liberalism of classical liberalism. So objectivism is a common neoliberal philosophy, believes in, this was also Adam Smith, government deregulation, free hand of the markets, so on and so forth. And what she says is, look, you have one obligation only, and that is to yourself. And everything else sort of stems from once you accept that. As somebody had said, about, well, what about when you fall in love with someone? Well, she thought love was selfish. She thought you should do it. She was for selfish acts, but love was not selfless, but selfish. It was because of how that person would make you feel. It was because of what you wanted. And she also said, well, when you say, I love you, the most important part of that is I. You can't have I love you without I. So that sort of underpins all of her economics, all of how she puts things together. Now, I had never read Ayn Rand or been interested in it at all, and I graduated from Clark University with BAs in psychology and philosophy, and a friend of mine said, oh, you think you know philosophy? tell me about Ayn Rand. I said, I don't know, and I don't care. And he was a very smart guy, and he challenged me to try to prove her wrong. I took up the challenge. I read the book about a year later. I read Atlas Shrugged a year later, and I felt I agreed with almost everything that was in it. I agreed with everything that was in it, but I said I disagree that this would work, and I don't understand why. Philosophers don't let go of things like that. They sit and they chew on it for a while, and I chewed on it. Finally came out why, and I decided to write a rebuttal novel that took all of her principles, but took out just a couple of the little Jenga pieces that she needs in order for her system to work. And I'll get to that in a minute. But long story short, she was another couple of interesting things about her. She was an atheist, and she said repeatedly that religion was the worst thing ever to happen to humankind. Now, she didn't like socialism, obviously. She was a capitalist, but she thought religion was worse than socialism, because socialism could only, in her mind, exist if you have the concept of a God, another being to which you are beholden. No, you're beholden to yourself, and that's it. But God allows you to be beholden to your brothers, to all these other people, and so she hated it. She was an atheist. So when you get Ron Paul coming up and saying, I believe in Ayn Rand, I am an objectivist, I believe in all these things, and he literally makes every one of his staffers read that book. He makes all of them. Steve, you would kill yourself first, because you would not be able to finish the book and wouldn't be able to actually get a job with Paul Ryan, my bad, Paul Ryan, because he requires everybody to read that book. But he goes to all the Christian breakfasts, and he goes and tells everyone that he's a good Christian and all that other stuff. Ayn Rand would have loathed that. And she said that Christianity is fundamentally incompatible with capitalism, period. You cannot have a truly capitalist society and have theists in any way, but certainly not Christians. So that's always interesting that people don't seem to hold his feet to the fire on that. So, okay, if you take a look at these books that she has that espouse selfishness, and you say, well, gee, how can anyone run a society this way? This is where it gets really interesting. She actually had an extraordinarily high moral standard. How she got there was reasonably interesting, but she genuinely believed and thought that you should never, under any set of circumstances, lie, cheat, steal, or take advantage of other people, ever. Now, what she said was that all of these acts are actually more damaging to the self than the person that you are doing them to. Because of that, you're actually violating her principle of being good to yourself. So when you steal from somebody else, you're damaging yourself more than the other person, which is a trite thing we all tell our kids, and it's sometimes true, but not always. In her mind, always true, period, no exceptions. Now think about that for a second. I lament the fact that someone who actually believed that you should never, under any set of circumstances, lie, cheat, steal, or take advantage in any way of other people, that person was thought of as immoral by most people. No, that's a high level of morality. And then she said, once you accept and understand that, you should do everything you can for yourself. Well, now wait a second. Think about this for a second. If you accept those principles, I think there'd be nothing wrong with being completely selfish at all. If you could accept those principles, if everybody accepted those principles, I think we'd live in kind of a utopia. Even if we were in this completely selfish, everybody doing everything for themselves, as long as they never lie, cheat, steal, or take advantage of other people. And if you look at the characters in her books, especially Atlas Shrugged, which is actually the only one I've fully read, if you take a look at her characters in Atlas Shrugged, they refuse. The capitalists that espouse her views refuse to ever do any of those things under any circumstances. Dagny Taggart at one point has her workers doing something that people believe she knows isn't, but people believe is more dangerous. So she said, look, I am going to pay my workers more money commensurate with this looks to me like commensurate with that level of danger. And if they don't want to work, they don't have to. I'm not going to force them. I'm not going to encourage them in any way more or less than just offering them more money. And that's it. It's their choice. I would never dream of interfering with them. Well, listen, if every CEO did that, you wouldn't need unions. You wouldn't need unions. So anyways, this was, she was actually a highly moral person. The problem is this. in order for her system to work, none of those things actually needs to be true. It doesn't need to be true that if you lie, cheat, steal, or take advantage of other people, you're hurting yourself more than anyone else. There doesn't need to be any truth to that. I think there's some truth to it, but there doesn't need to be any truth to that. What you do need to have is everybody believing it. Everybody has to believe it. You have to have probably a super majority, like 90% or more of people believing it. Imagine if all the CEOs believed that that was the case, that you should never take advantage of anybody because you hurt yourself more than the other person. Hugely idealistic, unrealistic, but imagine if they believed that. If they did, all of her systems would work exactly the way she espoused. There is nothing wrong with anything she ever said if you start with those assumptions. She didn't think they were assumptions. She thought they flowed naturally from her system. They don't. They don't. And that's my only objection to her. My only objection, for the most part, to anything she ever wrote is this: in all cases, under all sets of circumstances, when you lie, cheat, steal, or take advantage of other people, you're hurting yourself more than the person that you're, more than the victim. I, don't believe it's true, but even more, not true always. I do think it's true in many cases. And I think this system isn't going to work unless everybody believes it, with very few exceptions. And I don't think it's possible to convince people of that. In fact, if it were, fine, her system would work perfectly. So would Karl Marx's system. Socialism would work perfectly if everybody had that same, and that was, somebody had commented to me earlier, they were talking about how what they didn't like about Karl Marx's system was that it had all these sort of ideological assumptions. So does Ayn Rand. And if you grant the assumptions that either of them had, the opposite system would work just as well as their original system. So she certainly believed in, so like I said, for example, love was phenomenally selfish, but being selfish was the most moral thing you could do. Again, however, because she also believed that, so she believed your first duty was to yourself, but because she believed taking advantage of other people actually damaged the self, you are violating that first principle by hurting other people. I have never been able to see a credible way how she got from the objectivist, I exist, I am therefore obligated only to myself. I have no idea how she got from there to that somehow means that I'm damaging myself. She talked about suspending your reality to other people and a whole bunch of what really gets into woo, as far as I can tell. That's why I'm kind of hoping an objectivist is going to call in. Maybe they can explain that part to me, because that's actually the only part I disagree with. If you can accept that, everything else works. There's other interesting objections. There's Nash's, I was going to say Nash's game theory. He didn't invent game theory, but he added to it the prisoner's dilemma, which plays into this very nicely. There's all sorts of other details that I can sort of get into, but I think that's sort of the basics of it. When you talk about laissez-faire, she believed the government should do only really two things. They should have courts to settle disputes, and they should have military. That's it. That's all. Nothing else. Everything should be, you should be able to do heroin. You should be able to do whatever you want. Sort of this ultimate freehand system. Alan Greenspan was a protege of hers, knew her well, studied under her. He was a part of why there was the collapse, because he continued deregulation into 2007. The collapse happened around 2007. He was grilled by Congress, and they said, well, gee, how did this happen? And he said, well, by the economic models I studied, and what he meant by that was not Keynesian economics, but objectivism. He said, this isn't possible. This should not have happened. And he was really shocked by it. And he kind of tried to walk it back, but he admitted his model said this shouldn't happen. Self-interest should have protected everybody. Didn't happen. And I guess there's a lot more to it, but that's sort of it. Completely free. And there's a few others. Nestle's CEO, for example, wants to privatize water on this same thing. Okay, if water is privatized, people will want to protect it because there are companies that will lose money. As part of a government, isn't going to work. So that's it. They want to get rid of all government except for the courts and the military. There you go.
Yeah, there's a lot to digest there.
Take your time. I figured there was going to be a lot. I was hoping maybe.
First of all, I don't remember that part of the book. It's been so long since I read the book. I remember Taggart. I remember her as a protagonist, but I couldn't get into the book very much. I don't even remember if I even read the last chapter or so. I know I got at least like 80% of it done. I don't remember if I finished or not.
Oh, then I know where you stopped. Everybody stops at John Galt's speech. John Galt has a speech. It's 35 pages long.
Yeah, I know. I was up to that point, but I don't think I don't know if I made it past that.
Yeah, nobody gets past that, and it's all repetitive stuff. It's really actually poor writing. I think some of the writing isn't poor. I don't think she's a terrible writer. Well, in some cases she is, but she didn't explain. She could have cut. And if you go to The Water Thief on Amazon, you're going to see a tremendous number of comments, and like a third of them are, the book was okay, but it read a lot like Atlas Shrugged. And I was like, that was the point, which was probably my fault. That was my fault, but it's got 4 reviews. 4 stars. So at 130.
You said that she said only courts and military. Well, what about infrastructure? That's a spectacular question.
There are actually one of 2 ways to deal with infrastructure. The easiest way is to privatize the infrastructure. So everybody takes care of their own infrastructure. I am required to pay for the sidewalk and the part of road that's right in front of my road, and so is everybody else. A corporation has to pay for the road that leads up to their buildings, so on and so forth. And that way, if somebody decides, hey, I don't want to put money into it, fine, but then you're not going to have any road anymore. The problem is there isn't necessarily always another way around, so you're still also affecting everybody else. There end up being a lot of problems with that. But if you privatize 90% of, and that's what, again, in The Water Thief, that's what happens. That's why it's The Water Thief. It's about a guy who catches a woman stealing rainwater. And water's been privatized, air's been privatized. When you're born, you have to pay your parents back for the in utero nutrients that you suckled from your mother. Everything is privatized. Futures are privatized. And one of the interesting things was I talked about privatizing people's futures. We already privatized futures on just about everything except people. We've never thought of doing that. And I said, well, so in this book, people's futures are privatized. When you're born, and the more money you make or your greater earnings potential, the more your futures have value, yada, yada, yada. 2 years after I wrote the book, the first person ever, he was, I forget who, it was a baseball player for somewhere southern, maybe Florida, I don't remember. A baseball player privatized his futures and said he would pay a percentage of his income to anybody who gave him $10 million tomorrow. And there are now companies that will pay for your education in exchange for you owe them a percentage of your future earnings. That's privatized futures. So we are now doing that. It's a little scary how much of the book. I had to write anew afterward because so much of this book has been coming true. It's a little scary. But anyway, so that's that. And she also, by the way, so she cheated on her husband. Well, cheated is an interesting term. She had an affair with another guy. The guy changed his name to, what did he change? I had to write this down because his name was Nathaniel, and I forget what his original last name was, but he changed it to Nathaniel Brandon. Does anyone find anything interesting about the name Brandon? Does anyone notice anything interesting about that name? Brandon. Rand.
Oh.
He actually changed his name to include her name in it. That's how obsessed this guy was with her. This wasn't her husband. She had an affair with the guy. He changed his name so that it actually had Rand in it. But she insisted that in keeping with, you are never dishonest. She told her husband beforehand. Now, she didn't give him a choice. She didn't sit there. She gave him a choice. She said, your choice is you can stay with me or you can leave, but I'm going to have the affair. So she kept with her philosophy of being honest and not presumably taking advantage of other people. And this guy had to tell his wife. Things only went south when he had an affair and he didn't tell anyone about it. And when that came out, then he got kicked out of the grand organization that was being built and all this other stuff because he lied about it. That was the only crime he committed.
Well, apparently that was one instance where she didn't think her actions were going to hurt her more than her husband.
She felt that she was giving him the freedom to choose, and she could choose her own pleasure at any cost. And again, it doesn't necessarily. No, actually, you know what? I'm about to equivocate here. You're absolutely right. I mean, she didn't. If the fact that it would hurt him doesn't factor in any way. But again, when you're talking about hurting other people, yeah, this gets off. Oh my God, you're going to get into turtles all the way down with this one. Because okay, yeah, she's hurting him, but you know, she thinks it's moral because she's giving him a choice. But here's the problem, which is that what money allows people to do, and this is one of the things she did not consider, and Greenspan hasn't considered, is money does one of the things it's best at is allowing you to escape the consequences of your actions. Her philosophy requires that there are consequences for every bad act. Moral hazard, do you guys know what moral hazard is? Maybe in the chat they don't, so I have to discuss what moral hazard is.
Refresh my memory.
Moral hazard is the concept that you are creating an incentive to be either more careless or less responsible when you take away people's suffering of the consequences of their actions. One example is car insurance companies have actually found that if they insure you against theft, the moral hazard is people have less of a tendency to lock their doors. Now, it's not saying that you're interested in having your car stolen. You still don't want it stolen. But if you know it's insured against theft, you are less likely to actually lock your car. Moral hazard was a huge issue during the 2007-2008 crisis because the question was, do we bail out the banks? If we bail out the banks, then they say to themselves, hey, we can get away with this. Why not do it again? You know, maybe just be a little more careful, but let's try it again. If we don't bail out the banks and there are serious consequences, then people are less likely to do it again. So every time you mitigate the consequences, even if it's to save third parties, innocent third parties, if you mitigate the consequences to the guilty, they are more inclined to do it again. That's moral hazard. It's an old insurance term. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but it's an old insurance term. Now, why was I talking moral hazard?
Asked about
money.
Yeah, go.
Well, but money does something beautifully well that she didn't consider. What money does is it allows people to escape the consequences of their own actions. If O.J. Simpson had not been rich, he'd be in jail for murder. Period. There is no way around that conclusion. So, the CEOs of the big banks, including but not limited to Goldman Sachs, these guys should be in jail. They have too much money. There is no way to go after them. Doesn't matter if you got them dead to rights. So money buys this opportunity to get out. Now, she would say you shouldn't use it. But again, this is where she starts to equivocate. You start sitting there going, wait a minute, I'm supposed to be selfish, but not if I'm, somehow escaping the consequences of my actions. Well, first of all, everybody always thinks that they were justified in everything they did. So all the CEOs of all the big banks think, well, I was doing my best. It's not really my fault, so it's okay that I got off. Nobody in prison is guilty. Nobody in prison is guilty. There's a great scene from the the Broadway musical Chicago, which epitomizes the mentality of people in jail. He had it coming, and if you'd have seen it, you'd have done it too. So there are people in prison, yeah, they'll admit that they committed murder, but what they'll say is, I was justified. I'm not a bad guy. I wouldn't have killed him for no reason. I killed him because he cut me off in traffic. Are you kidding? You'd have done it if you had been there. So everybody always thinks they're justified. So when you have enough money to actually buy off the independent third-party regulators, whether that's the federal who oversees Wall Street?
Trade Commission?
Federal Communication.
Federal Trade Commission, isn't it?
FTC. Okay, Federal Trade Commission. Whether you're buying off the FTC, whether you're buying off the police, whoever you're buying off, that's what money lets you do in one way or another. And Ayn Rand's model has no means of dealing with it. The other thing is they've actually they've defined. This is cute. Ayn Rand's model has no inefficiency, none. It's a completely perfectly efficient model. Because there's no regulation that would cause inefficiency in the creation of new products and the innovation of the market. Here's the problem. She defines inefficiency out of existence. And Bitcoin is my favorite example of this. Bitcoin is a spectacular example. So Bitcoin is an online distributed currency. It is the darling of neoliberals because government cannot regulate it. There's no way to regulate it. There's no way for the government to interfere. It is distributed. It is peer-to-peer. the government cannot do anything about it. So people just, and it is worth what people decide it's worth. So perfect. It's the ultimate free currency. Bitcoins are earned by a process called mining. You mine for Bitcoins and eventually you get a Bitcoin. Great. Well, every time a Bitcoin is mined, there's one fewer Bitcoins available. There is in fact a finite number of Bitcoins, which has all sorts of inflationary or deflationary problems, but that's another thing. There's a finite number of Bitcoins. So when people started mining for Bitcoins, the more that you mine, it's a logarithmic formula. The next one becomes harder to mine, and harder and harder and harder. Well, eventually it got so that one person that could spend weeks mining for Bitcoin and probably wouldn't get one. And as you know, there's actually electrical costs figure into it because you got to heat the computer, and it's actually extraordinarily intensive to mine for a Bitcoin. So there's all these costs associated, and no longer became economical to mine for Bitcoins.
Wait, don't you want to cool the computer?
Yes, I'm sorry. The computer was generating heat,
Yeah.
and you'd have to cool it, and the amount of heat that it generated because you'd actually have to, you'd have to use GPUs, not CPUs. So you'd have to use graphics processors. So you'd have to drop in extra graphics cards, which run extra hot and require extra juice. That's where the heat comes from. So you'd have to cool them. And there was no way to do it. And then somebody said, well, wait a minute, if we pool our resources. So this is innovation. This is what capitalism is about. People are innovating. They're creating a new system. They said, let's work together and create a pool. So they did. And people would pool their resources and they'd split the Bitcoins they found. So they started doing that, and other pools came up, and there was more innovation, and people found ways to make better chips. And, wow, this is capitalism. This is what we're supposed to be doing. Awesome. Then it reached a point where so many Bitcoins had been mined, a pool going at maximum for, 2 weeks couldn't get anything done. And you're competing against all these other pools for the same Bitcoins. And if the entire pool in aggregate dropped $1 million, $2 million, $3 million on their hardware, it would up their chances of finding a Bitcoin by 0.0005%. You can't drop millions of dollars to justify that. And then somebody said, wait a minute, their pool is online. People connect online. If we do a distributed denial of service attack to the other pool, we can shut them down. They can't function. Nobody can connect and get into that pool. So they started, instead of putting extra money into improving themselves, they put money into knocking the other guy down. They started putting money into computers that sole purpose was to attack. And for $200, you could get a good machine that could do a DDoS. So they would start just with a small investment. They could knock down all the competition. This increases their chances dramatically because they're all competing for the same Bitcoins. Now what happens is those guys who are receiving these denial of service attacks say, oh my God, how do we stop this? Well, first of all, we're going to need to buy routers with stateful packet inspection, advanced routers that can stop this kind of thing, and we'd better start doing it back to them. So now they're investing money not in improving the process, but in hurting and directly attacking the other people. This is not inefficiency in a capitalist and or specifically objectivist model. It's not inefficiency. That's the cost of doing business. But in any other model, excuse me, that's inefficiency. That's the inefficiency that government regulations are designed to stop by saying you are not allowed to attack the other person. Government regulations are absolutely inefficient. They absolutely increase inefficiency in the system. But they also decrease it. They don't decrease it in the way capitalists look at it. Capitalists have just defined inefficiency out of the system as part of the cost of doing business. It's not the cost of doing business. It's inefficiency that's added by realizing that, and this was the only thing that stops capitalists is that the faster the heart beats, the quicker it dies. And what everybody here is doing is attacking each other instead of spending time and effort in mining, in making actual improvements to the system.
So you only have a certain amount of resources to go around. You can either invest those resources in mining more efficiently and mining better with better equipment, better cooling, things of that nature, because it is a very expensive process, or you can invest it on attacking other people and that kind of thing. But this is where I see Rand kind of talking out of both sides of her mouth. she'll argue that people should be, selfish for all practical purposes, and she argues that a person who is they're not going to want to attack somebody because it's not in their self-interest to do so. People shouldn't be going around trying to victimize other people. That somehow doesn't. It's not in my best interest to harm somebody else, because she would argue that it in some way harms me. But in this particular, your example for it comes to the economy, that person is harming somebody else and they're benefiting from it. But then it just into this long cycle of inefficient things where money is being diverted from the purpose of the thing, which was to mine a Bitcoin, into, hey, how do we screw over somebody else so we profit more? How we do better? That's not how I would base a proper economic system.
Well, and what you and the last several minutes of you and Nick speaking was a treatise on why Ayn Rand's economic system just ultimately will not work. I mean, it can't work.
Yeah,
that's absolutely correct. And I think I know for a fact that she was actually a highly moral person. I know that for a fact, and I lament the fact that people sit there. And this gets into when people straw man, either deliberately or by accident, they straw man atheists or they straw man theists. She gets straw manned a lot because people say, well, she was all about selfishness. Yeah, but it's in a different way, same way.
I get that. No, I don't have a problem with her morality. That's nothing. I think it's the economic aspect of objectivism that is fatally flawed.
But my point is, while I think she really was moral, I think she realized that was just her morality, and that unless she could convince everybody else to do it, it wasn't going to work. So she created a justification that every time I've seen it falls so laughably short and ends up being woo, spiritual, and all these. And she hated spiritual. She said anything that isn't ground in reality. So supernatural is not real. She hated all that stuff. But when it comes to that one issue of why you should never lie, cheat, steal, or take advantage of other people, it was always woo. And she did it anyway. And I have to believe that the reason was she realized her system would die without it. Despite the fact that she believed it herself. I mean, she was moral herself, but I don't think she was moral for those justifications. I think she was just a moral human being, but she'd slap me across the face if she were alive and heard me say that.
Something that I saw what this stream was going to be about, so I was online reading about her objectivism. And as I was reading through, like you were saying, Nick, there were certain things that they were talking about her that I went, oh yeah, I agree with that. But then there were some things I was going, well, wait a minute. And one thing I came across was that maybe you could explain it to me. She rejected the idea that there is such a thing as a priori knowledge.
Okay. So knowledge that, I mean, what do you mean by a priori in this case?
Well, knowledge based on experience.
Okay.
No, that's a posteriori.
Yeah.
A priori is knowledge not based on experience.
So if it's knowledge based on experience, I mean, I think should have one of the things that she felt was that.
I must have read that wrong.
The reason people, for example, commit rape or robbery or anything like that is actually they have not been raised properly. They have not had. She felt that the basic human intuition was reasonably neutral, but we certainly had no instinct to commit crimes. We had no instinct to hurt other people. If we hurt other people, it is because we misunderstood how to achieve that which is best for us. Because again, when we're hurting other people, when we commit rape, we're really hurting ourselves more than the victim, which is another. I mean, that's a bold fucking statement. Now, she thought that there was certainly nothing. There was nothing before the law of identity. So there's nothing that can come before that. So if you mean by a priori knowledge, anything that comes before the law of identity, anything metaphysical, anything.
Well, yeah, I misspoke. Like Steve said, I got him backwards, but it is a priority that she disregards that any knowledge independent of experience.
Yeah, there's no knowledge outside of, and again, that was the idea behind why it was called objectivism. And people are sitting there going, how is an economic theory called objectivism? Well, it is objectivism. It is an economic theory, but it's an umbrella. There are other parts to it. But when you talk about objectivism economically, you know, it's an economic theory too. She felt that there was nothing outside of experience, and more importantly, it was, in some ways, it was almost solipsistic. I mean, there was nothing outside of your experience. It was very just, I am, it's the ultimate sort of baby. It's, you know, the I am. It's all about me.
Well, the reason I was confused by it is because if she's going to reject a priori knowledge, I mean, how is 2 + 2 = 4 true because of experience? I mean, it's true without experience.
Here's the way this actually works. 2 + 2 is 4 is a priori as by analytical definition. You can discover it a posteriori. We can, you know, show, okay, I have one object plus another object, two objects. I can see that. But the way they for the difference between a priori and a posteriori is that even though you can discover something a posteriori, it does not mean that it's not a priori. A priori means you can know something without having discovered it or without having to observe it. So I can know 1 + 1 = 2 with axioms, even though I could, in theory, also know it by a posteriori means. That's what a priori means. That you can just you can know it without having to observe it or discover. Not that you can, even though you can, you could obviously discover that or know it by external means, by observation. That's not what it means. A priori means that you have the ability to know it without having discovery. That make sense?
Well, yeah. That's why I'm confused by it. Like, it just seems like, I mean, if you rule out a priori knowledge, aren't you ruling out that there can be any basic axioms or
I would think so.
Properly basic beliefs? I mean,
if you rule out a priori knowledge, you're basically saying all knowledge comes from discovery.
Well, and I think there's another problem, which is I think if you sit there and say, I think you're going to get into, and I think it is the problem of basic, properly basic beliefs, which is, okay, if you talk about, you're going to assume that I exist, and that's sort of the starting framework. That's an assumption as well. So
not only that, but she had properly basic beliefs. She had axiomatic beliefs, and she's ruling out a priori knowledge. I mean, how that's a contradiction.
Well, I think she might say that 2 + 2 = 4 is a synthetic a priori belief, which is to say that it's our observations of the universe. It's not true because of anything outside of the fact that we have defined math in such a way that makes it true. So it is an a priori belief in the same way that you could say all men are mortal. Socrates was a man, therefore Socrates was mortal. That, you know, it's true by definition, and it's a synthetic. It has no existence outside of the definitions that we have given.
Yeah, and I would say that it's not. This gets into the whole analytic synthetic distinction, but I would say more it's analytic because it's based upon analytical definitions of axioms. So it's not synthetic. To me, 1 + 1 = 2. I mean, unless you're getting into Kantian, a priori, what he considers to be a priori synthetic.
And she totally.
I think, yeah.
Okay, because there's a distinction between the way Kantian ethics would use it and the way it's used anywhere else. But
she was very well read.
Was the predicate being in the subject, actually.
She was phenomenally well read and was actually Aristotelian in where her starting framework was. And I don't remember all of the sort of Aristotle discussion of logic and knowledge that she was a big fan of, but she was a big fan of Aristotelian logic. And that was, I think, not on her deathbed, but at some point she said that was her favorite philosopher and probably her favorite human being in the world was Aristotle. So I think hopefully that gives some indication. And she was I think also a fan of Kant. Here's the thing that most people don't understand.
She was not a fan of Kant. She
Manuel and Kant. She was not. She actually went after some things Kant said from what I read too. A quick
Okay.
question. This is from back behind, and I'm sorry I did
There are
notice
30
this.
million questions. My apologies. I've been talking forever. This is what happens.
Yeah, we got to
Give me
get
a
some
mic.
questions. So Tom wants to know. He says, "How does Ayn Rand?" And by the way, am I pronouncing that right? Is it Ann or On?
Ayn Rand,
Ayn. It's
actually.
Ayn. Okay, yes.
I rarely pronounce it correctly.
Yeah,
It's
I
Ayn.
say Ayn Rand, but it's actually Ayn Rand, right?
Actually, it's Zenovna Rosenbaum. She was Russian. She used that name to avoid a Russian name, but she never actually had it.
But you're supposed to. But it's technically Ayn Rand.
Ayn Rand. Yep.
Ayn Rand. Yeah. So I'm just still going to say Ayn Rand because I can.
Please, I do it all the time
Yeah.
if I'm paying attention.
But I do know. Yeah, it's Ayn Rand. But she's. How does Ayn Rand interfere with the? I think what maybe means infer, but interfere with the abolition. The abolition of the gold standard.
No, she hated that. She was very much for being on the gold standard. That is a principle of all neoliberal economics. That's Austrian school, objectivism, and I can't think of the others right now, but there's at least any school. If it's neoliberal, they are for going on to the gold standard, which is ludicrous. It's silly. It is talk about just believing, something. Talk about woo. The gold standard is ludicrous. But she was for the gold standard, as was Greenspan, although he didn't necessarily say that all that publicly. But she was for it, for the gold standard. Hated being off it.
I mean, that's one of those things now that you think it'd be impossible to go back to, wouldn't it?
Well, no, unfortunately, I wish it were impossible. I don't think it is, and there's a movement.
I think it'd be very difficult.
I think it would be very difficult. I think if we continue to have economic troubles, the movement for doing that is going to grow. It doesn't solve anything. The point is that the dollar is a fiat currency, but what they don't understand is so is gold.
No. Gold is not a fiat currency. Gold has an intrinsic value to it, but it's not fiat. It's not debt.
Well, no, okay, no, but by fiat, I mean that simply that they have declared that it has value. So the only
that's
reason
different. That's not debt. That's not saying I wouldn't put that as fiat.
Okay, but in terms of, when you talk about in economic sense, a fiat currency is a currency that exists only because people have agreed upon the fact that it is a currency. So the only reason the dollar has value is because we've agreed it's got value. If tomorrow, all of a sudden, people lost faith in the dollar, it would have no value anymore. It is only faith that keeps value in the dollar. This is as opposed to a real currency such as water. It doesn't matter whether people think water has value. It doesn't matter whether people think land has value. It doesn't matter whether people think air has value. They all have value, and if you're short of any one of them,
gold is a commodity. But now, granted, we value gold for different reasons, but gold is considered to be a commodity. Money is considered to be fiat because it is worthless. There's no intrinsic value in the paper. The paper is saying this is $10 that's worth something else. It used to be, whether it's gold or silver or whatever, it said I can use this piece of paper that's worthless as intrinsic value, but I can trade it for something else that you want. I can trade it for an actual commodity. The commodity you're talking about, water is commodity, electricity is commodity. Gold and silver are considered commodities for the same way, even though we as a society have given them value. I agree with that. But we also value water the same way, but only different. This is that water we need to survive. We don't need electricity to survive, right? We could live, in theory, unless you're Kyle, he can't live without electricity. He would not last five minutes without his iPhone. He would just, I'm not kidding. He has, I think, like 6 battery backups, just in case.
Oh my God! I used to be that way. I don't.
So the most of us can live without electricity. We like to go camping, not glamping, but it is still a commodity, right? Electricity is a commodity.
I agree, and gold has many uses, practical uses, transistors and so on and so forth. But even then, and I think that's a fair observation. But I think when you look at I don't know if a Keynesian model would do this. I suspect it would.
I don't like Keynesian. I took macro and microeconomics from. I actually took it from Extension, Texas A&M. Believe it or not. Worst. I got a B in both. Hardest. I think the Keynesian economics and supply and demand were the hardest things I've ever had to wrap my head around. And this was after nuke school. It was bizarre to me. This was like I'm like, this is magic. This is.
I loved it. I loved it. It was so good. But here's the thing,
supply,
which was
demand,
the thing.
move curve this way. Oh, I'm like, shit, no, nuclear physics is easier than this crap.
That's one of the things I really loved. The reason I found it so easy was because, yeah, there is math involved, but it's psychology. It's basic psychology, and I already finished most of my psychology courses by that point.
Yeah, but look, if you have a differential equation saying like some flies in demand, you're saying, okay, look at, I make this much per part per commodity for my whatever it is I'm making, my widgets, is the most common thing.
Yeah.
And so I have an order for this. I have the supply for this. I've got this much demand. I have this much income coming in to make a certain amount. You can only make you only have so much equity to make parts. And then you would say, okay, here's the curve. Move over this way a little bit. It moves up a little bit this way. And it's all mathematics. And I'm just like, dude, I am not going to front. I had no idea what the fuck I was doing in that class. How I got to be. Don't know. Don't care. I hated it. It was harder than hell. It's a very hard class, macroeconomics. If
I had your teacher, I'd have failed. My teacher was all about concepts, and I'm very good with concepts in the big picture.
I thought I was, but not with macroeconomics.
What the fuck, Steve? You just said you didn't understand it at all, and you still got a fucking B.
Well, because I went to nuke school. I mean, I had a 4.0 in college, so yeah. I mean, at least I do understand concepts pretty decently. Usually, when I say something was the hardest class I've ever took, I'm not fronting. That course was freaking hard.
And I do want to get to other questions. I did want to get this John Maynard Keynes quote, one of my favorites. Capitalism is the astonishing belief that the wickedest of men will do the wickedest of things for the greatest good of everyone. I love that quote.
Well, I think everybody's at least got a little bit better understanding of Ayn Rand. I mean, granted,
I hope I didn't bore people with this.
No. And I think, look, I know she's demonized.
If anyone wants to.
Yeah, well, tell me how to get a hold of you.
Oh, well, no, if there were any chat questions, unless we got a bail, but I figured I'd like to get a few other.
Yeah, any other questions? I mean, I didn't want.
I got a question for Nick. Can you in the live chat link to where I can go to buy the book you were talking about that you wrote?
Sure, absolutely. I would be happy to do that.
Yeah,
I have a wrench. I have a wrench now, so I can do it.
Yeah, I can't. Well, don't feel so special. Utopia Buster 2017 has a wrench now too.
Oh, look, a lot of people have wrenches, but I'm just thrilled.
Yeah, the main reason why I give out wrenches, actually, it's two reasons. One, if I had to do slow mode, they ignore the slow mode, and two, when you type more than 4 things, you automatically get a timeout. This prevents that. So.
And I've gotten a lot of those, especially on the non-section.
We'll give you a wrench on that too. That's the only reason. It's not to moderate so much for certain people. I do have mods, but most of the mods, they don't really, like on this channel, they don't need a mod that much. It's not really a chat that really requires much modding. I just give it to people that have been around a long time so they can type as much as they want and not have to worry about it.
Well, what do you mean if you type 4? I've typed more than 4 things before on.
If it's in rapid succession.
In rapid succession.
I can't override that. That is fixed by YouTube.
Well, I'm a very slow typer, so that's why I've never experienced
I got some names of people that I should have strong. Like, how does Kawasa not have a spanner? Here, you have a spanner now, Kawasa. I just hand them out like water, so you're nothing special, Nick. I'm kidding.
I do that. That's what I said at the beginning, Steve, but you just had to bring it up.
I got to keep your ego in check. You're a philosopher. You're an author. You're going to be popular. People are liking your stuff. You're getting to be a little noted.
My wife is going to start paying you to just keep my ego in check. She's like, he really thinks he's all that. Could you just knock him down a peg or two?
Reed says, can you ask about extrinsic versus deterministic intrinsic value?
Oh, dear Lord. Okay, well, give me a second. I can only do one thing at a time here. So I'm putting in the chat. That's a copy of the link to the Amazon. That's where it is on Amazon, Kindle paperback, and I got other work that if people are interested in. And okay, so there you go. It's in the chat. So what was the question? Because it sounded like I really don't understand what it is.
Basically, extrinsic versus intrinsic value. What determines extrinsic or intrinsic value for something?
All right, hold on.
If you're not, I can take a stab at it.
Yeah, go. Yeah, why don't you take a stab at it and give me a second to recompose myself?
When we say something has intrinsic value, that means that it has a value for the fact that it's what it is. Gold has an intrinsic value for the mere fact that it's gold. You can use gold for things like electronics. It's used extensively a lot in electronics, right? I mean, gold is a great conductor. It's highly valued. Gold will always be higher valued. It has stood the test of time to hold its value. So we say that has an intrinsic value because of the substance that it is. An extrinsic value would be something that we evaluate, like paper money. The paper itself of money is worthless. It's paper, right? I mean, yeah, whatever, pennies on the dollar kind of thing, right? So that's not really what it's worth. It has no intrinsic value. What that paper allows you to do is trade it for something else in the form of a commodity. So we differentiate between something that has intrinsic value, gold, silver, precious metals and things like that, or even something even like a food. Food has intrinsic value, right? You need food to survive, right? So a potato has value to it because, you know, you need to eat, right? So these have some kind of intrinsic value for what they actually are. Extrinsic items don't have. And by the way, Tom, the link is out there. The link is in the video description.
Oh, awesome. So, and then the other thing I wanted to say, and this is just, I've been spending the last like 2 years doing nothing but arguing, anti-apologetics. So it's taking me a little bit to spin my wheels and get back into this. But there is a term, and I have forgotten what it is. It's an economic term for the things that you must buy or must acquire in some way or another. No, it actually goes beyond necessities, because you could say, for example, toilet paper is a necessity. Yeah. It goes beyond that. It is
basic needs.
No, it's a very technical term, but sort of water, land, so on and so forth. I mean, the reason it's called real estate. Water, land, a few other sort of things that you are required to buy no matter what you do, or required to obtain in one way or another. And so we were talking about fiat currencies, and in the sense of those things which you must have and have no choice about having, in that sense, gold is still fiat, because while gold does have intrinsic value and gold does have, gold will always have some value in some sense. Well, that's not entirely true, actually. So let's say there's an apocalyptic war, EMP wipes out all electronics, and it's just, us, and we've got nothing left. Nobody's going to give
You've just killed Kyle. Thank you very much. Fuck you.
I'm sorry, yeah.
Kyle. We have to get Kyle. I want to know if Kyle would rather just be the one that just dies right off the bat, or has to survive the apocalypse where there's no electricity.
Kyle is the one person who made it into a bomb shelter with the hunky guy of his choice.
With a power thing generator.
Yeah. So Kyle's okay. Kyle and one other person are okay, so he's not going to be lonely. And
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay.
So under that set of circumstances, there is still, in fact, economics, believe it or not. Now, there are some economic systems that don't work anymore, but sort of the more basic economic systems, there still is trade. There still is a necessity to survive, and there still is the idea that, fundamentally, I actually believe very much in open trade. Open trade, in its barest sense, is an absolute good. It is one of the closest things to an absolute good I've ever seen. And the reason is because the principle of open trade is I have more of something than I need, and you have more of something than you need. But that excess that you have is a lack that I have. I have less of that than I need. So I trade I trade my excess for your excess, and we each end up better. That's the principle, and in that principle, it's an absolute good. It gets used poorly all the time, but I'm a big fan of open trade for that reason. But those kinds of models, and those very sort of basic models, still absolutely work in a post-apocalyptic world. Gold ends up losing its value, and the things that only have real value is still going to be land, air, water, and so on and so forth. Anything outside of those things are, in one way or another, if you do sort of a reducto to them, fiat.
I think you could apply the same thing to land. We only give value to land because of where it's located, and the fact that I mean, there's enough land to go around, right? But land is prized because of
right
locality, right? I mean, somewhere in downtown LA is going to be worth more than somewhere in Kansas. So land has a value. That's not because it's the actual value of the land. It's not because of the land itself. There's no value of that land itself that's intrinsic. It's because we are assigning it value using the way you're looking at it, right? So I think you could probably do a reduction to any of that.
Well, not quite, because the reason that land has an excess has a higher price is because we already have an excess of land, and now it's not about the land that we need, but the land that we want. So some land becomes more preferable to another. If it's again a post-apocalyptic world, you cannot trespass or you're going to get murdered. Then all of a sudden land becomes important. You don't want to sleep where you're going to get eaten by a bear, wolves, anything like that. Land that is safe and that you can actually sleep on, all of a sudden is important. The only reason it's not important now, and the only reason it's become a luxury item, is because of a tremendous overabundance of it. But that perception of it as a luxury item is in fact only a perception that comes from the result of having far more than we could need. Air is seen as a luxury item such that nobody even pays for it. But that's only because of the overabundance of it. As soon as there is a, what's the opposite of an overabundance? Wow.
Deficit?
Yeah, as soon as there is an insufficient quantity as opposed to an overabundance. But then all of a sudden, nobody's, how we value it and how we price it's going to change. That can't actually happen with gold. There is a standard at which all of a sudden nobody's going to care about gold anymore. They're just not going to. That will never happen with.
See, I think gold will always be a standard, even if there's an apocalypse. It's the one thing that people always, for some reason, will use as a sense of currency.
All right, so we got another question.
I wanted to chime into this gold standard versus fiat currency thing. I think both systems have certain advantages. But the gold standard has a problem, which is this. Imagine a world where you have a gold standard and suddenly someone invents the internet and internet services. But everything is based on the gold standard, and gold is limited. Or rather, well, it is somewhat limited. It is dependent on the gold mining industry. So if the gold mining industry is not competing well enough with another exploding industry like social media or the internet, then suddenly you have the problem that if you base it all on gold, then all the services, all the production needs to be reduced. So suddenly you say, well, you're a barber, you charge $10, which is based on gold. Now you have to charge $5 because there's only so much gold to go around, because everybody wants to have the internet. Having a Barbary service is nice. It's still required, but it's less required relatively to the new exploding economy going around. So the gold standard is actually prohibiting the economy to grow. It means that other branches of the economy have to shrink for new explosive economies that are new and that are progressive. For them to grow, other economies have to shrink, and that's a problem.
I think that's true. I think that is a reasonably fair objection. However, that's also one of the points of the gold standard. So the fact that the dollar can expand for an unlimited amount, you've got two problems with the dollar. The first is the value of it, the quote value of it, can just keep going on forever. It can inflate forever until you get what the peso, and it takes $20 million to buy a tomato. So by putting it on the gold standard, gold is limited. And you had said earlier, well, you seem to suggest that gold wasn't limited as long as, we keep mining. But there is, in fact, a limited amount of gold on the planet. So we could mine forever, just like Bitcoin. Eventually, we will run out. And the idea is that what that does is that keeps inflation in check, and that is healthier for the economy. So while you do make a decent point, and that is a risk, there is no system, there is no a way to go forward and completely eliminate risk. The idea is that risk is mitigated by the advantages you get to having a currency that isn't going to inflate the same way a currency of which is an unlimited quantity out there. It also prevents the government from doing what objectivists, not just neoliberals, think is terribly dishonest, and they're probably right about this. I don't think it's as big a deal as they say it is, but which is to print more money to pay debts. So the U.S. government, if we get really bad in debt, what we do is we print more money and pay the debt with that money. That's got significant consequences.
Yeah, you think?
What we do.
Yes, I think. I think that is, of course, the other side of the coin. If you have a fiat currency, then you have this sort of seduction that you could just print more money and everything is okay. So that's the risk of the fiat currency. But what I'm saying is, well, the problem of gold-based or any whatever it is that is limited resource-based currency is that the economy cannot grow if it has changes like the internet. The occurrence of the internet is a rather spectacular growth economy. Then it is limited. It is sort of shackled with chains. It cannot grow because it is chained to a gold-based currency.
Well,
Yeah,
look,
there is no possibility to even get this achievement at all.
I'm having a tough time following this because, but wouldn't a solution that, say we were still on a gold standard, well, all it would mean is when you put more funds into the market, then you would just, this much gold represents $1. Well, then the amount of gold that represents $1 would just be less.
You have to think about it. If just a ship that has gold on it sinks in the Pacific Ocean, then suddenly the worth of what you're doing is somewhat.
The value of all the remaining dollars would go up because you've lost the total amount of gold in the.
No,
in the
but if you have a job and you earn $1,000, if a gold that is if a ship that is that has gold on its board and is sinking in the Pacific and it drowns and the gold is lost, suddenly you just now earn $900 a month.
Well, no, you don't. You still
$1,000 because the amount of dollars is limited. Now the amount of dollars is less, so that's it.
So your boss is going to pay you more because it sank?
No, he's paying you less.
He's going to pay you less
because it sank. Pay the same thing.
Yeah, he's going to. That's my point. He's going to pay the same thing. You're still getting $1,000. What you're saying is the $1,000 isn't worth the same. But those are two very different claims. Your boss is going to keep paying you $1,000, and that $1,000 may be worth a different amount, but it's also worth a different amount to the people you're going to try to trade that money to. Yeah. So it universally, it's going to affect the entire system. But let's be clear on one thing: when you say you're now making less, or when you now say you're now making $900, no, you're still making $1,000. Your claim is that $1,000 means less, but since it means less all the way across the board, you get all the coins.
Okay, Okay, Nicholas, but what if you are having a loan to pay off your car, or you have a loan to pay off your house, and suddenly instead of getting a wage for your labor of $1,000, you get 900 or 800, things like that, because
Why would you get
technical advancements say, well, your work is less worth in comparison. So suddenly you can't pay off your debts anymore.
Well, no, let's be a little more precise here. So, are you changing the amount of dollars that you're making, or just the value of those dollars? Now, your boss isn't going to say, "Well, gee, a ship sank, so I'm going to pay you less dollars," right?
Well, but the whole economy would eventually force him to do that.
Well, Tom, it's like what I said. It's like what I said before. If all of a sudden a bunch of gold was taken out of the system, all that would mean is that each dollar would be worth less gold. Like, if say an ounce equaled $1, well, then you lost a bunch of gold out of the system. Well, then all of a sudden, maybe for $1, it's only a half ounce.
Well, are you aware of what happened when the Spanish Empire collected a lot of silver from the New World? Suddenly, silver wasn't that much worth anymore, because suddenly there was a new supply of silver. So you couldn't just say, well, I paid you one piece of silver for this thing. Now I have to pay you 2 pieces of silver because there's just no silver around. Now just think of that in reverse. If the commodity that all your value is based on is suddenly reduced because a ship sinks, well, that's a strange scenario. But I mean,
it works. It's a good scenario.
If it is all dependent on the gold digging industry, like, then all your economy is more or less dependent on this industry.
What did you just say? Repeat the last sentence. All your economy, is that what you just said? All your economy is based on did you just say all your economy is based on this industry? Yes or no? Is that what you said?
It's based on the gold digging industry if you have a gold standard.
Yes, all your economy. Is that what you said?
Yeah, right.
The question you've been asking me is, what happens to the individual? What happens to you, the person, when this happens? But the thing is, it affects the entire economy simultaneously. So, yes, the value of the dollar may drop, but that affects the people that you try to sell to, the other people who are going to try to sell to you. That affects everybody in the economy universally. Now, the problem with the silver was a different problem. That was a flooding of the market such that silver lost all value. There's a great other example of that one. There's 2 other examples of that one that's spectacular. But when you talk about if you get rid of the gold, the thing is it affects everybody else in the economy simultaneously. So they're all going to see, and what's actually going to happen is if you reduce the amount of gold, the value of each dollar increases. Hold on. Okay, now I just lost my train of thought. Now, if that ends up happening, the man who is paying you a certain amount of money, that gold, that money is now worth more. How or where this gets complicated and starting to get beyond the scope of what I can competently and speak on.
Yeah.
But
it's going to wrap it up here soon too. So
okay. So, but the other thing is when you flood a market with a specific commodity, and I got a question I really want to answer because he's asked this like 3 times about military and self-sacrifice. That's a really great question. But when you flood a market, Star Wars Galaxies was, and I love the way some games, EVE Online is a spectacular game. EVE Online is a game that has such a spectacular economic system that universities have actually wanted to purchase the game from the owners so that they could just study the economics of it. It's a completely free capitalist free market society. It's an astonishing game and economic model in that sense. But Star Wars Galaxies, one of the things that the developers of that game decided to do, it was an MMO. Anyone could come in and play, and it was a fully simulated universe. They said, wouldn't it be great if we give everyone as much money as they want? And so they didn't hand it out for free, but it was just about, and anybody could get money anywhere they wanted. What happened? People stopped trading in that money. That money lost all value. And somebody could say, well, I'll trade you $1 million of this. Well, $1 million of that has no value anymore. I'd rather take 1 or 2 of something that's really hard to get. So it is true that how difficult it is to obtain the commodity, the rarity of the commodity, and the supply and demand. This is the other thing. I got into an argument about this. We do not set prices. In a capitalist system, nobody sets a price. The business doesn't set a price. The corporation doesn't set a price. Your grocery store doesn't set a price. The price is set by supply and demand. Period. End of discussion.
I would agree. Yeah.
All right. So now, if the if the supply of gold goes up, ostensibly, at least initially, the demand stays the same. So the value of anything tied to that goal ends up going up. If the supply goes down. So if the supply goes down, the value of anything tied to that gold standard is going to suddenly skyrocket. Actually, no. You know what? I think I'm probably going to end up passing more on this question because I'm going to start speaking.
Yeah, it's getting a little deep, ain't it?
All right.
Yeah,
Hey,
I think it is a deep question for sure.
It's a good question. Question.
Something you guys talked about a minute ago about just printing money. Now, of course, that's a bad thing. You said print more money to pay off the government debts and all that. But with this economic system where we're not on a gold standard and it is just fiat currency, you have to print more money because population is growing all the time. So more money has to periodically be put into the system, or eventually you would have, this large group of humanity fighting over this small finite amount of dollars.
Well, I don't know about that.
That's actually a very good point as well. Like, what happens if your population increases? Like, even if the amount of gold digging, gold supplying towards your economy can keep up with the economy, if your population is increasing, then still wages are going down because more people are around.
So how does this become Ask an Economist?
Yeah, this has gone a little slightly.
I'm a little tongue-tied today, as you guys can know.
But it's been a while.
That's why I joined, because economy is my thing.
Oh, see, Tom doesn't join when I do the science stuff or the philosophy stuff, which he likes. But he'll join.
Sometimes I do. Sometimes I don't.
If we're talking about local realism, he'd be in here in a heartbeat.
I'm going to call Uncle on it.
I might.
Well,
somebody asked you a question, Nick, that you were saying you really wanted to answer.
I did.
Let's answer that, and then we got to wrap it up. It's late.
Yeah, let's wrap it up. I think it was a good question, but it's probably beyond my scope anyway. So, and I'm starting to get tired. So we'll.
Was that? Oh, that was the question.
The question was about Ayn Rand's view. You see, I'm getting tired. View of the military service and how you could debate. How you could have
self-sacrifice. You said.
Thank you. Self-sacrifice in the military. Well, there are a number of interesting answers to that. These would all be guesses. And then I just read this guy was like, oh, by the way, I saw her speech at West Point, and I was just like, oh, good. So I get to answer, and he's going to compare everything I say to mine and the speculation based on what I know of sort of the overall of her philosophy. He's seen her at West Point. Great. Thanks. I think the argument would be not necessarily of one from self-sacrifice, and he's free to correct me, and I think he should, frankly. But anyone who's in the military, again, it's the same as any other system. They have to be compensated for the risk, and they have to be compensated for the deliberate choice of choosing it. They don't necessarily have a desire to self-sacrifice, and in fact, if they do, I think should consider that immoral.
Yeah, you don't go into the military. You go into the military, you realize that shit happens, right? I mean, we all take that chance. I mean, we all know that if we had to, lay down our lives, we would be expected to do so. And most people that have served have been in some, conflict situations, or many of them have. It's a hell of a thing. It sucks. But that going in, that's not self-sacrifice in that regard. I mean, even if you had to actually do a self-sacrifice, I don't know how that would be affected by objectivism. I mean, you still have to be true to yourself. I mean, I still think there's a part of you that you have you have moral duties and obligations, even if you put yourself first. I don't know if that translates to, hey, I'm going to be so selfish, I'm going to let a whole bunch of other people die rather than sacrifice myself, which you volunteered to do when you joined the military.
Well, that's the key, though. As long as you make the decision with a clear head to join the military, and you know what it means.
Yeah.
Once you join, you are required morally
right.
to do the best that you can, even if that includes self-sacrifice.
That's the way I would look at it, right?
You rationally made the decision to do it, and you have been compensated in whatever means that you feel that you're required to self-sacrifice if that's the clear-headed and rational decision you made. Although you wouldn't phrase it that way.
Hey, Steve.
Yeah.
A while back when we were still talking about Ayn Rand and all that, you said something about synthetic
versus analytic. Yeah.
Right, and then it took me a while to find this, and now I just went off of it. But it said that she objectivism disregards the analytic versus synthetic.
A lot of philosophers disregard the analytic versus synthetic distinction. It's kind of one of those things that, I mean, even Sisyphus Redeemed has a really good video on that. He rejects the analytical synthetic distinction.
Can you explain synthetic versus analytic?
Yeah, analytic would be something that's true usually by definitions, like axioms like that. A synthetic a priori would be something that you can observe. At least in theory, you can observe external to any kind of axiomatics, right? So if I can show something to be the case, like the car is red, that's a synthetic a priori. It's a synthetic. It's not, well, is it a priori?
I wasn't listening, so
usually something that's a synthetic a priori, something that we can verify without having to go observe it. So 1 + 1 = 2 would be, in the Kantian version, synthetic a priori, because it is true regardless if I go out and observe 1 coconut plus 2 coconuts equals 3 coconuts, or whatever. 1 plus coconut, one coconut plus another coconut is 2 coconuts, whatever. It's late, but I don't have to actually go observe that. I can, right? It is that it can be known independently of that. That's a synthetic a priori distinction. So analytic would be defined.
Analytic is something that you have to analyze. Oh,
well, or defined analytically, like 1 + 1 = 2 is defined analytically because of axioms. They kind of help. It's confusing, I know.
The other thing I wanted to share, when they're reading about Kant, is it said in the article I read that Rand rejected the Kantian dichotomy between things as we perceive them and things as they are in themselves.
Yeah, Kantian has the two Kantians are a weird thing. One, you're talking about phenomenon versus noumenon. What it is, a thing that is of itself. But the way Kant looked at synthetic analytic, he was looking at it more of the relationship between the propositional content in the predicate and the subject. It was an analytical proposition would be a proposition where the predicate component is contained in the subject, and the synthetic proposition would be where the predicate is not contained in the subject. So one is you have the predicate in the subject, when you don't have the predicate in the subject. That's the way Kantian described it, but that's not how like the general use of analytical versus synthetic is used. One is not used. It's so hard to explain this, right? Maybe Nick could probably do a better job on Kantian. I don't deal with Kantian ethics that much.
Yeah, and I'm sorry. I'm trying to keep up on the chat and just sort of thanking some people who would put some questions in. I felt bad that we didn't get to as many as I would have. And I got to thank Steve, because I was like hounding him, like, I'd like to talk about this subject. I'm gonna poke you in the eyeball until you say it.
He was bugging me today. He was like, hey,
well, hey. Yeah. Just remember, though, when Steve does something like this, if you have a question you really want to get in, there's phone numbers there. You can call right in and ask them right out of your own mouth.
Here, an analytical proposition is a proposition whose predicate concept is contained in the subject concept. An analytical proposition, this is Kant, a proposition whose predicate concept is not contained in the subject concept but related. That's according to Wiki.
And in fact, that's the only version I ever remember learning. I probably learned others, and I know there are others, and I forget who else sort of disagrees. And I know that a lot of people think that synthetic and analytic a priori statements are in fact essentially the same thing, and you can reduce them to the same thing. And,
yeah, that's why they get rid of that distinction. But I mean, an analytical bit, like for example, it uses like all triangles have three sides. That would be analytical because we defined a triangle as a geometric shape, a polygon that has three sides, right? So by analytical definition, a triangle has three sides, right?
Yes.
Okay, so they go on to say that, like for example, all bachelors, a synthetic thing, an analytical would be all bachelors are unmarried. That's analytical because a bachelor is defined as somebody who's unmarried, right? So that's analytically defined. But a synthetic thing from that, something you can derive from that, would be all bachelors are alone. Okay, they're using it. This is their terminology, meaning that a bachelor is going to be without somebody, right? So that's not how it's defined. But it's a synthetic thing, so that we can, yeah.
Yeah, it's.
I always hated that whole analytical synthetic distinction.
I loved it, and I used it. And I remember the first time I used it with you, you're like, "Oh, you're a Kantian." I was like, "Uh-oh."
Yeah, because Kant, I know Kant uses it differently, and it's very hard to describe the way Kant uses it. I'm not familiar that much with Kantian ethics, so I just I know enough to know that he did. So.
Well, and I was always a fan of the categorical imperative. You can't rely on it 100%, but there's no ethical, and there are issues. I'm a fan of it. It's just something I like. I
don't know. I don't know if there's a categorical imperatives or not. I know there's hypothetical imperatives, and that's fine with me.
Well, I had it explained by Seamus of all people once, but I was still scratching my head, so I will have to look deeper into it.
I do have a request. There's 65 people left in the chat, and if I could just, this has been this is hard for me for a lot of reasons that I haven't always talked a lot about. People who've been on my Twitter thread know I don't always talk about this honestly to a lot of people, but I want to let the people who've stayed behind know that if they could please tell Steve that I am attractive with enough alcohol. I would appreciate it. It would mean a lot to me. Now there's 64 left. Somebody else came on because I know you guys care about this topic.
When I can drink this whole thing in one sitting.
Let him know.
I just left because
his Twitter
buffering.
Go on and tell him that Nick Soutter is attractive with enough alcohol. It's almost enough to kill you, but not quite. I'd appreciate it.
So this went from egoism to egotism.
Gotcha. It started there. You started it on egotism.
Full circle. Egoism to egotism. All right, good way to end it. I gotta go, guys. This was fun. You guys got any suggestions for future episodes? Please let us know. I think we all kind of learned something about Ayn Rand, and I think that was informative. So thank you, Nick, for coming on and talking about that.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Well, an obvious topic is local realism.
No, we're not doing local realism. No.
Email him, Twitter him when you're telling him.
I'll tell you what. If I get,
I mean, how many dollars do I have to?
I'll find somebody. I know a few physicists that might be able to just come on and talk about it. I like the topic. I really do. I just think that other people would be bored of it. Because I reject local realism, and I know you do too. So. All right.
No, I don't.
Yeah, you do. You just don't know it. Are you a Bohemian kind of guy?
I don't put all my eggs into one basket.
Fair enough. No, I got you. All right. Good night, guys.